Ladies and gentlemen, let's get going. It's nice to see you all again. Today we have a very distinguished speaker from Microsoft, a guy I've known many years, Dan Reed. He's a former UNC Chapel Hill professor and a one-time member of the President's Council on Advisors in Science and Technology. So that PCAST committee is a very pivotal committee for national policy in healthcare, energy, and things like infrastructures. And Microsoft, of course, is a key enabler of healthcare, a key enabler of our energy programs, and a key enabler of most intelligent infrastructure aspects, the things we care about a lot in CITRIS. Today, Dan is Microsoft's corporate vice president for technology strategy and policy and extreme computing. The extreme computing group is part of Microsoft Research, but of course its mandate goes way beyond basic R&D. It's to help the company as a whole look into the future and question that is the whole nature of computing. And as we organize in our organization around CITRIS and the possibility of bringing the Simons Institute to campus here, we know that these fundamental questions of computer science are going to continue to be our lifeblood in this building and very much the whole of the UC Berkeley campus. So I'd like you to join me with a warm welcome of applause for Dan Reed, please.
Thanks, Paul. My pleasure.
I'm going to hop down to the front there and listen to your talk.
So I'm a pacer, so I'm going to walk back and forth here. Most of my background is in high-performance computing. One of the things I realized fairly early on, though, was that the ability to shape change really lies at the confluence of science, technology, policy, and society. And so I want to talk about what I think some of those challenges are in that space. So if you just think about the pace of change, and in many ways the key message I want to leave with you today is that the pace of technical change is challenging the ability of many of our social structures in a wide range of areas to adapt nimbly to the pace of that change. It used to be that many changes occurred on a generational basis, and that allowed us culturally to adapt in interesting ways. There's an old joke in science that says the way that new ideas take hold is old scientists die, and it's not without some cultural truth. But when there can be wholesale changes in just a couple of years, those evolutionary processes are under great stress. And I want to talk about some of the domains and I think where the intersection of those things come into play. So all of these issues about how we think about the societal changes, the economic challenges that go with them, and frankly, all of the issues around how multi-party innovation works in this space is part and parcel of that. So let's sort of think about some of the big technical changes, and then I want to talk some about their intersection with sociology. So purely from a technical perspective, you think about the rise of large-scale cloud services. As I said, I'm a high-performance computing person. We're building worldwide networks of large-scale data centers that are bigger than the individual. A single data center is now bigger than the internet was, all of it, just a few years ago. And so the scale and scope is bringing some big issues of access to data and a whole bunch of issues around privacy and security. We all know about the consumerization of IT, the explosive growth of mobile devices, and the issues that come with that. The rise of the Internet of Things, embedded sensors, and the ability to assemble systems on a chip with a diverse set of sensors and functional units that can deliver targeted performance capabilities. That mix and match capability of heterogeneous design is upsetting many of the historical ecosystems around computing. The growth of data and sensors that go with that. And then I would argue that one of the other big changes that we're right on the edge of seeing is that fundamentally the way that we interact with computing has really not much changed since the Xerox PARC WIMP model first appeared, of windows and icons, menus, and pointers. And whether you are a fan of Microsoft or Apple or Android or choose your favorite technology, they're all variations on that theme, greatly refined, but fundamentally variations on that theme. And most of computing is a stimulus response mode, in the sense that your computing device is passive unless in most cases you literally poke it. And so how we think about moving to more natural experience where we can rely on speech and gestures and context awareness to bring in a broader swath of the population with digital empowerment is another one of those big changes that natural user interfaces are on the edge of happening. But put that together with the societal factors that we know about. You know, the rise of dramatic growth in population, the shift in demographics around the age distributions globally, the fact that we're seeing huge pressure because of climate change and energy management, the whole healthcare revolution that's borning around personalized medicine and what's possible there, the fact that I mentioned at the outset that what we take for granted, that most of you are students, what Berkeley teaches you, the specific skills will get you your first job or maybe your second, they will not get you your eighth. The sustainable skill is the ability to teach yourself new things. And how we think about that rate of change and what it means for mid-career people is a big issue in a knowledge economy. And then, of course, all the globalization issues that come with that. So you put that together with this tripartite set of issues, the rapid pace of technological change and exponential growth of capabilities, the societal issues that come with that, and then some issues I want to talk about around the intersection of both of those with policy and how we drive change collectively with an informed populace around many of these issues where you really need to reason through complex technical issues on a short time scale and not on a time scale that's measured in decades. There's some deep, deep issues there that we have to come to grips with. And so back to Alvin Toffler's original concept of future shock, the fact that we're seeing exponential change is creating pressure, and it's really challenging many of our legal and social mechanisms. But the trick is, how do we work together to think through some of those issues? And as I said, that's a bit about what I want to talk about. So I want to speak a little bit about some of the challenges of scale and internationalization around clouds, some issues that are deep and profound around the notion of privacy and security, some about the way that we communicate wirelessly and broadband issues, a bit about energy, and we'll see how far we get in terms of time. There are more topics than we'll probably get to, but we'll see how far we get. They're all interesting, and they all have this tripartite combination, maybe a bit about research universities. So let me start with clouds and ask, you know, what is a cloud? And it is arguably, I feel like this is the time I should do my best airplane imitation and say, well, it's a visible body of water particles, but that's not important right now. The truth is that it's really a Rorschach test because people have imprinted lots of different notions about what a cloud is on top of those things. I thought I would sort of put this in context by showing you a concrete example. This is a picture of part of one of Microsoft's cloud data centers. This is an overhead schematic. If it looks a lot like a loading dock for a trucking company, there's a reason for that. The model is that the building block is one of shipping containers filled with pre-configured computing components that can be backed in on trailers, plugged into umbilicals for power and networking and cooling, and that you can bring up large scales quickly. You know, one of the things to remember about computing is, I don't know a lot about it, but I do know that anytime you change one of the parameters by an order of magnitude, the answers about what are the right ways to approach problems tend to change some, and this is one of the issues here. It's about scale. To sort of put this really in perspective, this is how big one is. And all of the folks who are building cloud data centers are building them at this scale, right? The economics of the technology are driving massive consolidation. And I'm going to talk about some of the issues of that and what it means. But, you know, orders of magnitude bigger than many things we have built in the past with many, many petabytes of data and hundreds of thousands of processors in them. But here's one of the cultural challenges that goes with that. which is that we now have data, much like the international monetary system, flowing across national borders on a regular basis. Because the scale and scope means that if you're a small country, you're not likely to have one of these facilities built in your country because the economics just don't call for that. So here's a very real example. You're a Kenyan national. You're working for a German multinational company whose data happens to be stored in a data center that a US company like Microsoft runs. Maybe the data center is someplace else in Europe like Dublin. Maybe it's in the US. You just got on a plane with your mobile devices and you flew to China. Whose laws apply to you and your data? It's a Kenyan law, it's a German law, it's a US law, it's a Chinese law. The answer is yes. And there are big issues around that because the social expectations about those issues differ widely around the world. And people, frankly, are struggling to try to reconcile those. Why? Because most of our notions of legal sense, privacy, and security have historically been rooted in notions of person and place. And this is a logical issue, not just a physical one. So there are big issues, and they bring together lots and lots of conflicts. The issues about national sovereignty, because no government is going to cede national sovereignty. That's just a political reality. It brings issues of global economic competition about who controls what. It brings a bunch of issues around both civil and criminal law. Where can governments reach? Social norms and behavior. European sensibilities about privacy are frankly very different than US senses. And both of those differ in some equally profound ways with senses of privacy in parts of Asia. And then you've got some issues around national security, which are another thorny issue, but I'm not going to talk about that today. So here's a way to think about this. Where you put stuff actually does affect the answer, and not all data is the same. Today's traffic in Berkeley doesn't have the same intrinsic value, or maybe it does if you're in a traffic jam, as business data or personal health care data, right? There is a continuum of a sensibility about the value of data and how tightly you might protect it. It varies a lot in many axes, but there is a continuum. But here is the current legal reality. The data that you have on your premises, whether it's in your home or apartment, on the Berkeley campus, or in the state of California, or in the United States, or someplace in Europe, the issues about the levels of legal reach are actually different, right? They vary in each of those cases. And as data flows, we face those challenges. There's a continuum of issues about how you manage risk and reward and the issues around that. There's a famous case that, for extra credit, you might want to go read about if you don't know about it, related to the Bank of Nova Scotia. Anybody here have their money in the Bank of Nova Scotia? So I'm not picking on the Bank of Nova Scotia at all, but it's an interesting legal case. So the issue was they were challenged, so this is a Canadian bank, challenged by the US government to produce data that was stored offshore in the Cayman Islands. And the bank responded to the US government and said, we can't produce that data without violating Cayman's law. And that was the truth, right? That discovery would have violated law in the Cayman Islands. And the US government said, well, tough, right? You got yourself in this situation. It's not our problem. You have to cough up the data, or you are subject to US penalties. That's a very real case. And all of these issues about international flow bring those things to the fore. There's another dynamic at work here. So how many people have heard of the US Patriot Act? Okay, most of you. For those of you who haven't, it's really about what the US government can do in terms of engagement to fight terrorism and the powers that law enforcement agencies have for access to information and the mechanisms around that. If you think about why we invest in IT from an R&D perspective, we're trying to create new value, new technologies, things that can drive economic and social benefits. That's one aspect of the creation part. The other part is how do you use it to do stuff? And there's a global competition going on around that. And the U.S. Patriot Act is being used as a fear and uncertainty and doubt issue to color the global competition among folks in this space. And the issue really that's mentioned is, if you're a U.S. company, can you protect the data of British citizens, for example, right? It brings those national conflicts to the fore. The truth is, every country reaches across its national borders if its citizens are involved, right? That's a legal reality, goes back hundreds of years, but it affects a lot of these conversations. And so many of these things are a collision of cultures and policy and legalisms that go back a long way. And I mentioned the Bank of Nova Scotia cases. So there are big, big issues around this. Let's talk about big data a little bit. So there are lots of estimates about how much data there is around. This is one recent number. You know, it's within spitting distance of Avogadro's number. I won't stand here and tell you from a Shannon's information theory perspective that there's information in all of those bits. There's a lot of redundancy in there, and the amount of knowledge is even smaller. But it's a heck of a big number, and it's growing by leaps and bounds on an annual basis, made possible by the economics of cheap storage and lots of sensors, of course. But think about some of the issues around it with respect to privacy. So let me sort of talk about some of the issues around the ways to think about it and maybe some technologies. So think about social networks and the web. You can actually go trace the entire history of my hair loss on the internet. If you search for Dan Reed and you look at some longitudinal pictures, you can find it out there. I have no way to pull those back. I'm okay with that, and the hair loss too. There's nothing I can do about it. But we all know that once you put something out there, it's potentially out there forever. And we may actually want the ability to change that. Some of the European privacy discussions are about whether the right to be forgotten is in fact a human right. Right? Do you have the right to anonymity? It's an interesting question. It's not yet resolved. But here are some ways I would suggest we might want to think about the flow of personal data and other kinds of data on the internet. One is the notion of bounded lifetime. Can I bound how long some data is out there? All right, that's one aspect. The other is transitivity, right? I may choose to share some data with Paul, but can he share it with Dan, right? You know, where can it flow, right? So there's shifting dynamics about trust relationships. So bounded lifetime transitivity. Another axis to think about is claims-based. Why and for what purpose am I giving you access to this data? Because if it's an informal case, that may be a reasonable situation, I don't want that data necessarily to be used to determine whether I qualify for a car loan or a mortgage. Right? So how do you affect the claims-based access? We don't have good mechanisms socially or legally or technologically yet to be able to manage that nuanced basis. And anybody who's ever struggled to configure their social network privacy policies knows how complicated that really is and how many groups have gotten in trouble for getting it wrong. So we're clearly going to have to work through a bunch of these issues given the growth of data. There are a couple other ways to think about it from a technology perspective. You know, there are the issues about key management, and you probably saw in the newspapers the issues about, you know, the question about whether RSA was broken or not. That's really a deeper conversation about the entropy of keys, and it's particularly important for small mobile and embedded devices where the computational complexity of generating good random keys is much more challenging, but some fundamental issues there. The rise of searchable and fully homomorphic encryption, ultimately the hope of being able to do computations on encrypted data so that it's not exposed, because right now you have to decrypt it, you can do something with it, and then you can re-encrypt it, and while it's exposed, anyone potentially has access to it. And then finally, some issues related to these things I was mentioning on the left about how do you manage the tagging of data and the protocols and the enforcement mechanisms about what are the rules that can be applied to certain data. Because privacy is more than a binary thing. Security is more than a binary thing. All of the times that we deal in our social circles of interaction, our business and personal, we have very nuanced and rapidly shifting notions about what information we're willing to share. We don't have the same nuance in our technology and the mechanisms associated with that to manage some of those things. As I mentioned about privacy and security, you think about the history of those things. The castle doctrine, that your home is your castle, that you're secure there against government intrusion. You know, things like the UN Declaration of Human Rights and what are the specifications about what can be done relative to individual privacy and security. And our problem is almost all of those things are about physical entities, locations, and people and their place. And we're going to have to move beyond a lot of those things to think about what's the concept of how we protect a digital persona, whether it be an individual or an entity, and how we deal with the complexities that I was talking about before, given the wide variations that we see around the world. And I will tell you that all of the companies that are involved in this space are struggling with a very simple concept. How do they deal with global cultural diversity? Is there any common safe harbor of rules that are globally acceptable, or does it require regional and nuanced differences, and how do you deal with that given the mobility of people and organizations? It's a really complicated, practical as well as ethical challenge. Here's what I worry about most, though, and it's not the transactional data. So, you know, you can choose not to use your credit card, you can choose not to go to an e-commerce site, you can even choose not to use your web browser. Maybe inconvenient, but you do have a choice. And each of those choices involves a notion of informed consent. Well, it may not always be as informed as you want, but there is a notion that there are rules specified and you agree to the EULA or the terms to do this. And there's a compact and a contract there, logically and philosophically and legally about what will happen. Those things are transactional based and a human is engaged. Now you may be overwhelmed with those, and in some cases the choice may be a Hobson's choice. You can say yes and use the service, or you can say no and not, and that may be all the choice you get, but there is a choice. But the rise of sensors and passive data is a whole deeper issue. And it's not a new one. You think back to the history of photography as a simple example. There were deep and complicated and ugly legal battles about whether one could take a photograph in a public space or not, whether I have the right to take a photograph of another person, right? Because that was a very sensible question about, is that an invasion of privacy? You know, passive sensors, drones, all kinds of ways that we track data, whether it be cell phone traffic. You know, I've got a picture up here of the 520 bridge that goes across Lake Washington in Seattle. And you know, all the issues that we now have we lost all sense of anonymity, and do we have any right to control that capture and use of information in public and quasi-public spaces? Unresolved but difficult issues. Let me say a word or two about wireless, and I want to talk just a bit about another place that I think we're facing social challenges. So these numbers are huge. Right? What does it mean about the global internet? Well, one thing it fundamentally means is we are not representative of most of the planet. Right? When the internet was created, it was a creature of the US. It was, for a time, a creature of the US and Western Europe. The US and Western Europe are a minority of global internet users, and that will forever be true going forward. There are some deep issues around that. So think about some of those challenges. So let me just throw out a couple of things to think about. How is the internet governed? What does that mean? Is it governed at all? Well, it actually is. I mean, there are clearly technical rules about managing the domain name system, about address translation, about traffic routing. Those are technical rules. And the IETF and the Internet Society and ICANN have always managed those things. At least their evolutions of those entities have. But there are deeper issues related to all these privacy and international data flow issues that I talked about. So one of the fundamental things that's being debated globally right now is the internet in the future managed in sort of an ad hoc, non-governmental, collaborative, multi-stakeholder model, or does it become a top-down government-managed entity? That issue is unresolved, but it's going on now because the clash of cultures and many of the issues around it are important. It's not just the business aspects. You know, if you look at the Arab Spring and the issues about the challenges of flow of information, you know, for governments, it's a governmental concern. You know, some good, some bad, some ugly, but real issues there. You know, that issue is hotly debated globally, probably will come to fruition before the end of this calendar year. Right? But deep issues going on at many levels, from political to technical, about what the mechanisms are for long-term internet governance. And it's related to this issue of globalization. As I said, lots and lots of issues there. Let's talk about wireless and broadband. So in a world of mobile devices and big services that we use those mobile devices to access, broadband, whether it be wired or wireless, is sort of the air that lets those things breathe, because a mobile phone with no network connection is not all that useful. It's a mobile computer, but most of the reasons you would carry it around have suddenly disappeared. One of the things that I want to sort of leave you with to think about is the way that we manage the allocation of wireless spectrum in particular hasn't much changed since Marconi thought wireless was a really cool idea. And it's another one of those collisions of culture and time. Here's a way to look at it. This is the US FCC spectrum allocation map. This should be scary to you. It reflects the better part of 75 or 80 years of allocation of spectrum to little bands. And we did that because the radio technology that we could design at the time meant that you had to design for a particular range of frequencies. Now, spectrum is a lot like land. You know, beachfront property has a higher value than the stuff that's in Kansas. Don't underestimate the importance of farmland, by the way. That's not a comment on Kansas. But not all spectrum is created equal, because the propagation characteristics are very, very different across the ranges. The other thing about it is, like beachfront property, it's a national resource. You can't make more. You can share it in time and you can share it in space, but you can't make more. And we all know what's happening in terms of the rise of demand. Anybody who's experienced a dropped cell phone call or a slow data connection knows about that. But here's an ugly little secret that, despite all of the discussions about that, that is true. One of the things that my teams have been doing has been building spectrum observatories in various parts of the US. And the goal is, in collaboration with some friends in Chicago, is to look and see what's actually used. And the truth is, across a wide range, most spectrum, most places, most of the time, is very lightly used. It's allocated for purposes, but it's not very heavily used. And to sort of pick on my friends in Iowa, you know, maritime frequencies are not heavily used in Des Moines. There's just not a lot of big tanker traffic in Des Moines. But it's allocated on a large spatial scale. And so this is actually a picture of Seattle sweeping from about 30 megahertz up to about 6 gigahertz. And you can see, you know, here are the bands. Here's some aeronautical navigation. But in terms of utilization, occupancy, and this is over a period of a month, not very heavily used. There are times when some bands are heavily used, and it really matters. If you call the fire department, you really do want them to come. And you don't want someone web surfing to be the reason that they don't come. But most of the time, it's not heavily used. So what can we do more nimbly to share things? And I think the ultimate answer has got to be a combination of technology and policy. We've got to think about a lot of these issues about much more nimble, adaptive spectrum sharing, and that takes you down the whole road to something called cognitive radio, the ability to adaptively manage spectrum. I want to talk about one particular example of that my team's been involved in over the last decade or so. So remember what happened with television. Several years ago, in the US, we made the transition from analog to digital television broadcasting, right? And that brought us HD and other things. A couple things happened as a consequence of that. One is, not many of us actually get television over the air anymore. Most of us get it by cable or satellite. Well, satellite's over the air, but it's different than a broadcast tower sense. It's not true in all parts of the world, but it's certainly true in the US, that most of us get TV over wired connections. If you look at the channels in this spectrum that are allocated for TV bands, you know, the 6 megahertz wide channels, not all of them are in use in any particular geographic area, right? The UHF and the VHF spectrum. So the whole notion of the so-called white spaces is to say, is there a primary use and a secondary use? Can you use the spectrum for wireless communications when it's not being used for its primary purpose? And the answer is yes. Remember back to my beachfront property conversation, one of the reasons why the television broadcasters and the FCC picked those bands is because they have great propagation characteristics. You know, if you get up in 60 gigahertz, this is a long way. On the other hand, if you're down in the VHF bands, 100 miles is not necessarily a long way. So one of the things that is moving forward is the notion of using these so-called white spaces, the empty TV bands, for an extension of Wi-Fi, to create what some folks have called super Wi-Fi. With, if you want to think about it this way, the range of mobile or cellular, but with the flexibility and ease of access that Wi-Fi brings, so that you could build Wi-Fi-like access points with cellular kind of range. That process has been going on a long time. In fact, the discussions have been going on for well over a decade since the digital TV transition. Microsoft has been heavily involved in that. A bunch of trials. We're doing a big UK trial. We've had trials on the Microsoft campus for a long, long time. The hope is to create sort of a complementary extension of Wi-Fi that can create more unlicensed access to spectrum as a complement to licensed access, so that there are two complementary economic models that can accommodate sharing. But this is sort of a toe in the water toward cognitive radio, because here's how the white spaces model works. You turn on a device, it queries a database, and the database tells the device what channels are available to use. And the answer could be 0, in which case it can't communicate at all. But if there are some available, it says which ones, and then the device can operate in those frequencies. But it has to back off if someone turns on a TV transmitter. Think about generalizing that, where you could start to say, what we really want our devices to do is to dynamically negotiate for access to spectrum along many axes. You know, what power levels I might use, how long I might use, what I might pay for it, what quality of service I might get, all of those kinds of things. But it's a much more dynamic, adaptive model. And the technical enablement of that, of software-defined radio and cognitive radio, where a lot of what used to be built into hardware can be shifted into software, so that there's a much more nimble and adaptive mechanism that lets some sharing happen. So that's really what this is about. Let me say just a word quickly, and then I want to take some questions about population and energy. So we all know versions of these numbers, that population dynamics are shifting rapidly. You know, the rise in the number of people, the urbanization of the planet, and the challenges that come with that. What does this mean about energy? Well, I mean, there are the traditional and renewable ways of thinking about this. But here's the ugly truth. The Western model of energy consumption for the standard of living to which we're accustomed cannot be extended to the rest of the planet at the per capita energy consumption that we expect. That means one of two things have to happen. Either we disenfranchise a large part of the planet, which is not a socially acceptable thing, or we all have to change what we're doing. And I think that's going to be a big, big set of issues. But everything I said about sensors, about big data, about adaptation and wireless communication comes into play in that story. How we think about nimble energy management, you know, the whole ecosystem from grid to sensors is a challenge. And I'll give you an anecdote to explain not only why it's a geopolitical challenge, but why it's a cultural challenge, even technically. I was in a smart grid meeting recently with a group of folks from the energy side and a group of folks from the computing side. And the question that we were all posed was, think 30 years into the future about how we attack the smart grid problem. And I said, being the somewhat difficult person I can be, I raised my hand and I said, I'm confused. Because you're asking me to say what I think computing will look like in 30 years. You're asking me to tell you a science fiction story. I have no idea what computing is going to look like in 30 years. And I would question anyone who would say they know what computing is going to look like in 30 years. And you only have to look back 30 years to have that belief. And the person said, well, this is really a problem. And I said, why? And they said, because in the utility business we're in, 30 years is tomorrow afternoon. And I said, oh boy, we've got a cultural cognitive disconnect here about how we think about the rate of issues and the scope. And that's another one of those issues about rate of change and possibilities. Because I wanted to talk about things like how we do intelligent transportation systems, how we learn from sensors about traffic management, how we think about managing energy use in homes and how that could affect utilities. And their issue was, how can we get enough data to be able to determine how much generating capacity to turn on and off? And so both are important issues, but very big cultural disconnects about those. But do not underestimate this issue of privacy. And you need to look no further than the dynamics around smart meters in the state of California to understand that these issues about the collision of sociology and behavior and technology are deep and profound. How you communicate the issues, how you build consensus, or at least how you build a multi-stakeholder discussion is deep and real. I'll leave you with this last thought. You're at the crux of how to address this issue. Because universities in the US and worldwide have gone through a whole series of punctuated equilibria. And we're at one of those points right now, where the compact between the citizens and what research universities do is in flux. It's manifest in economics, but it's manifest in the expectations that are being imposed on us in public-private partnerships. So think about the history of universities in the US. You know, when the US was created, if you weren't white landed gentry or going to be clergy, you didn't go to college. Those are the only folks who had access. You know, that got broadened with the land-grant institutions in the Civil War and post-Civil War era. And an interesting thing about those is the charge for, if you go read the history of the Morrill Act, it was those institutions were supposed to bring practical agricultural and mechanical skills out to the population. And that's what was extended, you know, with the cooperative extension service turn of the last century. At the end of the Second World War, there was great horror in parts of academia that the unwashed masses of returning service people from the Second World War would destroy higher education. It didn't happen. It brought some great things, and many of us were benefits of that kind of thing. Arguably, the federal funding base for science that came out of Vannevar Bush's work in the war, but also his great essay after that, The Endless Frontier, and the rise of federal funding for science really transformed things. The Sputnik scare and the investments in fellowships and science was another transformation. Civil Rights Act, you know, other issues around higher education, Title IX, all of those things brought change. We're in the midst of another great change. How we deal with this confluence of technology, of policy, and society is going to determine what happens in this country and around the world in the years and decades to come. It's an exciting time, but it's also a challenging time. And I want to stop here and make sure we have time for a few questions. Thanks much for your attention.
Just saying, we have microphones for people to ask questions.
Hi, on Spectrum, at the risk of throwing too many over here.
Oh, yeah.
At the risk of connecting too many dots and being too cynical. We have the internet seems to be migrating online, where to wireless, where there's no net neutrality. You've got 4 national players, 2 of which are much larger and richer than the others. Light Squared seems to be dead as a potential competitor. Clearwire isn't in great shape. WiMAX seems to have been defeated, I don't know about technically, but commercially by LTE. The short of it is the white spaces, you said, have taken forever to be realized. How cynical do you have to be not to be very sanguine about the possibility that the incumbents will allow unlicensed, open, innovative, competitive uses that may threaten their perceived business interests?
Now, it's a good and very practical question. I'll give you a tidbit, first of all, to sort of put this in context. If you look at data traffic associated with mobile cellular plans, right now, roughly half of all data traffic flows over Wi-Fi. There are lots of reasons for that. Some are related to the challenges of building out cell towers at a rapid enough rate to keep up with demand. Truly, one of the very practical issues for that build-out is the permitting approval process to be able to site a tower. There's a lot of NIMBY. I mean, it's a real issue, but it affects some of those things. The complement is really time scale. You hit on all of the right issues, and you have a right to be cynical. These things evolve at a glacial pace, and what I'm really saying is that can't go on. We need to have more rapid change, and we're going to have to hark back to something that Dick Feynman said after the Challenger explosion. Reality takes precedence over public relations. Ultimately, nature can't be fooled, which is a fancy way of saying, we have to share more, otherwise it's not going to scale. What I'm really suggesting is it's not an either or about licensed or unlicensed, it's an and. Because there are complementary models, there are different economics around build-out, and even the folks who are holders of licensed spectrum desperately need the rapid build-out that unlicensed can bring, and the rise of Wi-Fi hotspots is prima facie proof of that. We're going to have to do both and move to a more nimble sharing mechanism. But all of these issues, spectrum is an example, the change in healthcare is another, energy is another, they bring in where all of us would probably say, if you were the first settlers on a new planet and you were going to set up a system, would you pick the current one? Probably not, but neither can you start over. So you look at places you can find some ability to make change, and you hope that evolution and the practical reality of physics and technology will get you further. But you're right, it's complicated.
Just so your dulcet tones.
So I like your slide, but we're here at the university. I want to know what the next slide is going to be with this. So if you can share some of your ideas, that would be great.
So I actually do have a next slide, and I skipped it in the interest of time, but let me show it to you. It's this one. So I think we've got to back up, and the whole point of my punctuated equilibrium slide was there's a great temptation to believe that the structure of the modern research university was brought down by Moses on a third tablet. The reality is there's been real change over not only in the US over the last 100 years, but even if you think about the birth of the modern research university in Germany, it's changed a lot, the last multiple 100 years. So change is inevitable. I think there are 3 or 4 things that we need to think about. One is we have to think about the nature of lifelong skills refresh, and that's why I drew this continuum. So you think about the UC system and its partnership with the state system and community colleges. If you're 45 and you lost your job because that whole economic sector got destroyed, you're not going to come back to the university and get another degree, right? It's just unlikely in most cases to happen. So how do we think about, as an educational system writ large, doing continual skills refresh, where what matters is a certification that you have a skill set, not that you have a degree, right? Because if you have the skill set and people believe it and you can prove it, you can get another job in a new domain. That issue about what the evolution of distance-based education is, you know, the MITx stuff, what Stanford's doing, what Berkeley's doing, there are issues there that have to be thought through. They challenge lots of our cultural senses, though, about what a professor is and what the reward metrics are. We've got to think through those, given some of the realities. I think on the research side, you know, think about at a high level what the dynamics of a research university are. For a public, the fraction of funding that state is going asymptotically to zero. It may not get to zero, but it's certainly down in many states, down below 10%. That's a reality. In the US, research funding is plateauing. It's incrementally going up, but it's scarcely keeping pace with the rate of inflation. And tuition is skyrocketing, right? Partially to complement that other decline. Those are not sustainable issues. At least the skyrocketing tuition is not at some point for social stability reasons. So we've got to rethink some efficiency issues as well. I think there are some opportunities to think more expansively about private-public partnerships and global competition. But that really takes us down the set of questions about national economic competitiveness policy. We need to have that debate. And then we've got to hark back, I think, in some ways to what's our mission about service. And that's why I mentioned the land grants, because I think how we take knowledge and skills and capabilities out into the communities has got to be part of our thinking forward as well. Because any entity that is funded by citizens has expectations about behavior, and we've got to have that open dialogue, get it out in the open, and talk about it honestly, because the rest of the world is.
This gentleman had his hand up first. We have time for a couple more.
In Africa, cell phones were able to advance very quickly because the landlines, of course, were non-existent for most of the population. And I'm wondering if in the United States, where we have a wonderful infrastructure in so many ways, we also have a questionably wonderful infrastructure of laws and governance which does limit the ability for companies such as Microsoft to make a lot of very fast progress in many of these areas. How do you feel about China and the other parts of the world where perhaps they're not as bound by these kinds of things, and what kind of development and research is going on in those areas?
So it's a really good question. It brings together, I guess I would say, 2 or 3 interesting questions. I think companies, countries, and regions, they all have cultures, and they're distinct, and I just mean in the human social sense, but in the way that is socially acceptable to attack certain kinds of problems. And there's not necessarily, there is some good and bad, and there's just some different. You know, maybe I would sharpen the question and say, the question in some sense is, will the current U.S. economic model, now I'm speaking as an American, will the current U.S. economic model remain globally competitive going forward? That's one way maybe to phrase the question. And I don't know the answer to it. If I'd be a wealthier man than I am now. I think we've got to think about this balance of grassroots and top-down, and that's really another way to slice the issue. But I think one thing that is critically important is we have to respect the human rights issue that cuts across all of these issues globally. And there are some very deep and thorny issues there about the global ecosystem at play. But to your point about mobile phones, to go back to that quickly, one of the reasons why that happened, as you said, was landline service was so lousy that there was ability to leapfrog technology. I would say in the white spaces kind of thing that I'm talking about, one of the most exciting places to think about employing that technology from a digital inclusion perspective is in fact Africa, and an enormous amount of interest across Africa in that kind of thing to bring democratized access for data services and the economic development things that go with it. I don't have a good answer to your question, but it is a deep question about what the future holds.
Well, last question.
Hi. Very interested to learn a little bit more about the distinctions between how Europeans, Americans, and Asians view privacy.
Okay. Some of it is actually, I think, born out of our history. Let's be honest, if you look at European 20th century history, the uses that governments put to personal data was not the most salutary in some cases about what happened with persecution and death. There's a cultural legacy there that has colored, and rightly so, I would suggest, about the way that the European Union has thought about codifying some of those issues in the privacy principles that the EU has promulgated. We have in the U.S. have a somewhat more pragmatic perspective, but I think it also depends on how you frame the question. So let me make it very personal. If I say to you, I want you to give to a large company every bit of history about every consumer product you buy, are you willing to do that? If I turn the question around and say, are you willing to let them scan a coupon at the grocery store to get a 15% discount on groceries, it's the same question, but it's asked in a profoundly different way. And if you talk to folks in the privacy community, the social way and the norms around the phrasing of that question gets you a very distinct answer. And that's true in a lot of these issues. Absolutely. The smart meter issues, to say how you phrase the question elicits different answers. And that's why this is so difficult, because there are the ethical issues, and on the two extremes, we can probably come to agreement that this is wrong and that this is right, and then there's this big gray area in the middle. In the gray area in the middle, there's probably some right and some wrong, and then there is just social consensus. And how do you get social consensus? The battle over internet control globally is in fact about the government aspect of this issue. You know, how much control does the government have over the network to do packet inspection, to manage who gets access, to track data, versus whether that's more anonymous. And then the private sector aspects are, you know, what rights do companies have to the data that you provide, and all those issues about claims and transitivity and bounded lifetime come into play there. But on the continuum, and this is a sweeping generalization, and there are exceptions to everything I'm just about to say, but on the continuum, the Europeans are over at one side. You know, the U.S. is sort of in the middle, and then you've got, you know, Asia and some parts of the developing world on the other side. And like I said, there are country exceptions and group exceptions all along that continuum. But that dynamic is the challenge. And when you have international flow of data because of mobility of people, transnational business, or even transnational government interactions, all of those issues come to the fore. The last thing I would say quickly is think about this rate of change issue. We have all lived in cultural islands for most of humanity's history. The internet and global communications have changed that, and what it has done is it has brought into social collisions disparate cultures. Those cultures are not good or bad, they're just different. And how we reconcile those differences is part of our challenge and why these issues are so complex.
That's a very nice summary.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. As usual, there's a I4 seminar on Friday.